Yay. Hello, friends. It's 10-ish, a.m.-ish. Well, it's definitely a.m. in Redmond. And it's a day that starts with a T in English, so it's time for .NET API review. And I fixed my technical glitch only shortly after starting the stream instead of before, so oops. And yeah, as you can see, we have a screen full of things marked as blocking. As such,
I cannot see the screen, Jeremson.
Yeah, I forgot to share it with you guys. Okay, as the internet can see, we have a screen full of blocking issues. People who are on the call get reduced privilege. Alright, is it working now?
Yes.
Okay. Alright. Right, so we have a big red screen of blocking issues, but Emo has very helpfully provided us with an agenda that's something other than just top-down, a little bit based on how long things have been on. So ignore the top-down for now, and we have an order that I hope that I open the tabs in the right order, and if not, people will yell. Alright, first up is finishing off what we talked about on Thursday, but lost quorum about halfway through the meeting, which is the structure for the IEEE decimal types. So my recollection is the only thing we really have left to talk about is creating these things as, I don't know, let's compile time values other than with strings, which we proposed as a constructor instead of a named static method. And if I'm right that this is our only real point, take it away, Drew. I guess if I'm not, then tell me what else we missed.
Yeah, technically you noted conversion discussion. I'm pretty sure that we came to the conclusion that for converting between decimal 32, 64, and 128, the conversions are going to live in the same pattern that we had for other types. So I don't think there's any huge discussion there in terms of which type has the to and which has the from. But yeah, the constructor is the real thing that needs discussing. Basically, the argument for why we need a constructor here is that you can't use literals for these types, and you can't safely convert from a different type that does have access to a literal without potentially losing precision or without potentially not being able to represent every possible value that a decimal 32, 64, or 128 could hold. So we have introduced a constructor with previous numeric types, notably int 128 has a constructor and uint 128 has a constructor. In this case, the constructor API that we've decided to expose is going to be a signed significant and a signed exponent. So users don't have to input a sign manually. So essentially users will be able to write significant times 10 to the exponent and input significant and exponent to create any decimal that they wish to create. I've used this pattern roughly when unit testing some of my implementation, and it feels fine. It feels natural, I suppose. So, yeah, that's the proposal.
And the use of this constructor would be you write, for example, the literal pi with as many digits as you can fit in the significand, missing
Yep.
the decimal point, and then pass as your exponent negative however many digits you typed minus 1.
Exactly. Yeah.
So 314159 e negative, I don't know, I'll assert 6.
Yep. That sounds right.
I don't know
Yeah.
that most people know significand and exponent, but they sound sort of familiar enough that I'd probably figure out what they were, especially if we
Yeah,
had an
and
example like the pi example.
and that's what we've exposed in the past with try-write significant little endian and try-write exponent little endian. I believe that's what they're called. But yeah, so it's just matching the naming there.
The other name people sometimes use is mantissa, but the spec term is significant, and so that's what we've used elsewhere.
All right. Anybody in particular, anybody who wasn't there during the second half of Thursday, want to give opinions on that? Oh, looks like we could have approved it with just 3 of us since nobody has an opinion. But that's not how approval works. Who do I have dead video for? Emo. Alright. And then, okay, so just to remind me, what's the simple state of what we decided for the conversion operators? They live on the type converted to when possible?
We have an existing pattern we followed elsewhere of we said this on review on Thursday. I don't remember which direction, but we have a pattern and we're following the same pattern in the proposed APIs.
Okay. Fair enough.
Yeah.
Because if I recall correctly, it comes down to the generic math helper of convert one type to another. Checks one direction before it checks the other, and we went with the first check order, I believe, right?
I think it's simpler than that. For every type that has existed before the decimal types, all of the conversions are going to live on these types.
Right. But it's the
for
3 that are being potentially added together.
Between the 3 of them, each of them will hold either the from or the to of the other 2, and I can't exactly remember which one it is, but we're gonna match.
So looking at int 128 again, int 128 exposes the explicit operator uint 128, which means it takes an int 128 and converts to a uint 128. So the type contains the 2 APIs.
Okay.
So decimal 32 will contain the conversion to 64 and to 128. And then likewise 64 will contain the to 32 and to 128.
Okay. So we prefer the type to contain its outgoing construction.
Yes.
Sure. Okay. Alright. Seems legit.
That's what I call a GitHub quick review.
We occasionally do them. Boom. Alright. On to new business. Make it easier to create quality validate option result instances. 77404.
Yeah, I can talk about this one. So in Microsoft extension options library, we have a type is called validate option result, which is represent the result of the option validation in general. And this type is used with interfaces called validate option, which is have a method is called validate, which is uh, return option validate option results. And the issue here is inside why if you want to implement this interface and return this validate option result and in same time trying to validate multiple options, not just one. So you have to carry what like multiple results from your validation, and at the end you need to combine it in one just validate option result object and return it. So the proposal here is to introduce this builder, which is make it easy about like, to use it while validating multiple things. And at the end, you can build all the results in just one object inside the validate option results. Should we go to one by one here? I mean,
another thing I want to mention is the model is such that in the happy path, when validation succeeds, this tends to make it so you don't allocate any memory. So the happy path, you only allocate some objects if there's a validation error.
yeah.
I mean, the first thing that jumps out at me is we have a static empty or static zero parameter create method. Can we not just make the default constructor, or sorry, the default initialize state work, or does this need to like call into DI or something?
But the design guidelines saying that it's not recommended to have parameterless, like constructors, right?
It says for reasons that Tanner might argue with, but it still is what it says. Don't define custom code in a zero argument constructor on a struct. But it does say you should strive with every effort possible to make the default state of a struct useful. So the question is there code inside create?
I recall, like there will be issue about if some, of course, maybe this is not applying to this case, but while allocating like array of structs, this will require like calling the constructor for every item inside the array to make this initialization, right?
Right. So again, the thing is, so the question is there code inside create? And if so, could you get rid of it? And then if so, can you just use the fact that it can be created with new/default?
So in the original implementation that I submitted, I think I provided implementation. The default is work the same as calling the create function.
Right. So then the question is, why do you have the create function?
I'm also
Actually,
sorry. I was related to that. I'm also confused because presumably that means it's doing some sort of lazy allocation or something to store things like errors, but it's marked as a read-only struct. So how does that work?
Sorry, I take it back. No, there's a field initializer that gets invoked. So default if t does not initialize that.
Right, but for Steven question also, we can use the unsafe to initialize the errors inside the read-only struct if we need to, as implementation details.
Well, except you can't. So.
Right.
So your basic shape here, what I see is you have a thing that's called a builder, which means you expect it to do mutation, but it's a struct.
Yeah.
So if you pass it in some state into a helper method and it passes by value, you can now tear your state across where you passed it in by value and where you didn't. So you've marked it as read-only. You're planning on cheating using unsafe. That super breaks if somebody passes something by value. So to me, this is an easy, you have to be a class.
Yeah, we were trying to avoid allocation as possible here.
I mean, it could be a mutable struct. We do those every once in a while.
Still don't
If
like
it's
them.
if it's really an important path to avoid an allocation.
Yeah, but does this defeat the same issue as that Jeremy just mentioned? If you pass it this struct to as a value to other method, and you'll end up with two different states.
Right. I mean, that's why immutable structs are discouraged because they are harder to get right. But if we only expect us to ever use this, and it's, you know, not something that most people will be writing code against, only if you were writing the infrastructure associated with validation, we could, you know, basically say you always have to pass these things by ref. And we do that now and again when it's something that is sort of critical path. So, or we make it a class.
Yeah, so within our code base, this tends to be used by the code generator, the option validation code generator, but also is used by handwritten validation.
Right.
So the reality is, in the implementation, it is allocating a list. So it is allocating an object. I forgot about that case. So there's always at least one allocation when running through here. So if you made it a class, then you still have that single allocation, and you can defer allocate the list inside.
And you'd only pay for that you'd only pay for that list if you actually had errors, right?
Exactly. Yes. But you still pay for the class at least. Conceivably, that class could actually be, if we cared, could actually be in an object pool and get reused.
Or you could just instantiate it until you had errors. Right.
Well,
it could be a class.
The pattern in the use case here is you create one of these builders, and then you validate the 10 different things that you need to validate, and you're just saying, oh, if this is wrong, add an error. If this is wrong, add an error. So deferring the allocation, you could defer the allocation. It just gets unpleasant from a usage standpoint.
What does it mean to add an error that is a null validation result? You have it as add error validation result with the validation result being nullable.
Because there's a funny because validation result, a successful validation result is null.
Okay, so then should add errors IEnumerable validation result be IEnumerable validation result question mark?
With a greater than between them.
Yeah. I think
but if null is success, does that mean add error no ops if it's past null?
Yes.
Yes, that's right.
Right, as in order to avoid the caller having to say if result is not null, add error result.
Correct.
Strange to me that there's a method called add error that wouldn't actually add an error.
Well, it all stems from the fact the semantics are kind of broken. The fact that null means success actually leads to weird behaviors, and you need to put question marks in places you don't want them. So from a compositional standpoint, it just works better this way.
Maybe it doesn't need to be called add error then. Maybe it could just be add result.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You don't know if it's an error.
And then correspondingly, the IEnumerable would allow the enumeration to contain null as well. And I presume the same thing exists for options result.
Certainly it would need to be IEnumerable of validation result question mark. What's the reason for the outer question mark? There's something that returns you null to indicate none of the validation results were null?
There's one of these objects that contains a list of validation results, and that captures that use case.
And that list itself might be null? I'm wondering, I think to Tanner's question, I'm going to change his question slightly. Should that question mark be moved to the left of the angle bracket, or should there be two question marks?
I would go. So the semantics right now is it'll work if there's two question marks. So the code checks for null, and then it just calls it. Then it iterates the enumerable and just calls add error on the value.
And there's something that is itself typed as collection validation result question mark.
So I wrote this 2 years ago, so I forget the details.
Because if there's like a method that's returning this collection, and the pattern we want to have here is add result, blah, then I guess it makes sense to have two question marks here. But if that's not the pattern, then I'm curious what the pattern actually is.
Well, let me go look.
Are these? Well, that's being looked up. Are these two add errors based on existing API? Because if not, they're overloaded incorrectly. Because the string, the simple add error says that the string in position 1 is error. Additional parameters go at the end, not at the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, like the second one is add error passing property name and the error message. The intention is saying like, this error message for this specific property name. Flipping it will look a little bit weird to me, but
I mean, the alternative is you get rid of this one and somebody has to pass null for the property name. But our 99.9% overloading rule is that this is wrong.
okay.
Unless you are exactly matching some existing API inside your namespace. Like this is a builder for a thing that already has the shape like this. But
No, I don't think there's an equivalent.
Yeah. I'm fine to flip it if you want. Or we can have add error, which is take a default values for the parameter property name, and we end up with just one API. So it will be add error, string error, and property name equal null.
that sounds reasonable to me.
I realize we're pushing a whole bunch of questions onto the stack that we're going to have to come back and resolve. But the constructor that's taking the errors, what's the use case for that? Like I thought the pattern was you call something, you get back results, you add it. You call something, you get back results, you add it. What's the use case for that constructor that takes the errors up front?
Yeah, I think we have the similar idea inside the validate option result itself. I mean, it can take enumerable of errors. The same. Let me double check that.
So I'd be happy to provide use cases within our source base for all of these things. I'll just need a little bit of time to dig it all out.
Sure. I mean, my high level is I'm just trying to understand how this thing is used, and if it's what was described of create a builder, then you call the thing, you get back a result, you add it, you call the thing. I'm curious in what situation you're creating a builder pre-populated with errors.
Yeah, so some of that was to mirror existing API surfaces. But like I said, it's 2 years ago.
Did we decide on the struct versus class part?
No,
Yeah,
that's
it's
part
class.
of it. Oh, okay.
Most of our builders are classes, except for value string builder.
Which is not
it-
public.
Yeah.
Right.
Just-
Yeah. The only we tend to have the the T is a struct and the T builder is a class, but I don't think we have any cases where the T is a class and the T builder is a struct publicly.
Is
So
this
it's
something
just
that-
what I was trying to achieve is minimum allocation in the happy path when you're starting and you're validating a couple hundred things.
Right. I mean, in the happy path, doing that will be no worse than what is there today, right? Because today you're basically replacing the read-only struct with a class, and then it will lazily initialize what was a list today. So that list gets deferred until there's an error.
Which means this is
In
actually
theory, we could
allocating
make
less.
Yeah,
Well,
in
you
theory,
replace the list. Oh, the list has two objects it's allocating.
well, the list has allocates an underlying array if anything is stored into it.
Okay.
So it's probably a slightly smaller allocation instead of a slightly larger list, but not a particularly measurable. I mean, it depends on how. Is this really something that is super hot path that needs to be optimized for? Because if it is and it's only ever in source generator code or code written by someone who really knows what they're doing, we can make an immutable struct. It just requires a lot more understanding of how to use these things. So if it's not super hot path, or it's one additional allocation on a startup path or something, or it's used by lots of code, it'd be better to just make it a class and keep it simple.
Well, if it's a class, I just change the code generator to reuse that object as well.
Are these resettable in some way?
We can add a reset.
Yeah, so it would need a reset function. Yeah.
Or we can have after build it reset itself. Right?
Say that again?
If we build it, I mean, the builder itself has build method, which is build it. If you
Yeah.
build it, so it can reset after that.
Is that
So
the,
usually
the
if
right?
our
builders do that? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I would expect semantically that the builder, you can continue from where you do build, and you can continue from there, and just keep building more.
Okay.
Honestly, I'll say it again. Like, instead of pooling, it would be a lot easier to just not allocate it until you had an error. Like, it's just a null check every time you want to add an error, which you would expect to not be a lot often, right? If you're optimizing for the no error case.
Yeah.
Right, like the generator basically doing open paren builder question mark equals new builder close paren dot add error. More or less.
Exactly. Or a helper method that did exactly that. Ensure
Right.
builder.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Is it worth the complication in writing the code like this? I mean, like, I don't expect like
And
to
to
be able to
reset, and to figure out reset semantics and pooling semantics. I would do it that way, I guess.
Yeah, I mean making a generator write more complicated looking code to save on the one object allocation if you think it's worth it is a good thing that generators are good at.
Well, and that's the context in which I wrote this class this type in the first place.
So we're saying if we don't expect other people to use this class, mutable struct maybe, but if we expect normal, quote unquote, normal developers to use it, not mutable struct, right? That's kind of the
Yeah, I
rule.
think you said there would be user, non-generated users of this type, and
Yeah.
they could either write the complexity of delay creating their builder, or just say that they don't care about the one object and create the builder and have simpler looking code. Like,
I just meant when we thought it's okay to use mutable structs. It's okay if we don't expect quote unquote normal devs to have to use it. Like interpolated string builder, it's a mutable struct, but we don't expect normal devs to have to write that code. It's just the compiler uses it.
That's right. And the few API developers that expose that capability. So we have them. They're just few and far between because it is really easy to shoot yourself in the foot with them.
Right, and like the UTF-8 JSON reader is a mutable struct, but when you screw it up, you just rewind instead of lose data. Like you'll overprocess data, and then you'll figure out your bug really quickly. Losing data often people don't notice until very late in the game.
All right, so I just posted a small example that I took from our code base that uses this pattern. It actually is very nice to use. It's very simple. No checks, no nothing. So I like for the handwritten case, it works very well this way. So I wonder if we can achieve similar semantics.
I mean,
Like
the builder.create today already allocated, right?
Yeah. So if you turn it into a class, then it performed the same way.
Right. You can still do that. You can still say var builder equals new validate option result builder, allocate up there, and then if dot add, if dot add, if dot add. But if you really care about not allocating,
the code generator could do better. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Or you could handwrite it better, but in a normal quick and easy case, you just do it with one tiny allocation.
Yep.
Okay, class it is. Like Jeremy said.
All you have to do is say things in an authoritative voice, and everyone else comes to the same agreement, or same conclusion.
Yeah.
All right, so
It's just sometimes I feel like I'm dying from 1,000 cuts there. Every change like this means I need to have a migration path.
that is
A better place is the hope, right?
Yeah.
I think.
the purpose of the API review is for people who haven't written code yet, not people who wrote it at the prototype phase. Sorry.
So
So it's we have hundreds of services using this, so prototype is kind of pushing it.
So build that returns a new option result that is the culmination of all of the things that were added.
Yes.
Should that be called to validate options result, which is the same to pattern we use for other builders?
Aside from string builder, what's another builder we have that uses two?
Immutable array, immutable collections.
Okay.
String builder.
Yeah. Most of our builders, as far as I'm aware, have the pattern of converting the builder to the T is a to T method name.
I feel like we do have some in crypto that are builders that just call it build.
Okay. Crypto's weird.
Yep.
It's like intrinsics.
Do we have guidelines for this in general?
I don't think we have anything written for a builder pattern.
Okay.
Yeah, so
I'm fine with two validate option result.
so like
Yeah.
this builder's verb was build. So
I think the reason that we've done two elsewhere is because it follows a pattern that allows other types to be done. Like with the immutable builders, there's a couple different methods for two. We've got the drain version, we've got the to immutable array version, we've got one that converts it just to array directly instead. I don't have a preference, just raising it because that's something that popped out to me as differing from the other builders I normally use.
I would choose to go with the common cases. I mean, like with two validate option result.
The only contradiction I'll have is like in extensions like hosting, we do call it build. Like the host builder calls it build, but I think it's a gut call on they're both probably valid.
Is there ambiguity in calling it build?
It depends on if you ever want to have other things in the future. Like, would you ever have a case where you would want to return a validation result instead of a validate options result?
Then wouldn't that might be the case where you add the to method instead?
Well, but then
Right.
you'd have a build and a 2 as opposed to two 2s.
And is that really confusing?
Oh, yes.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. There are APIs that do the same thing functionally, but which are accessed and exposed via completely different names, which is what makes it confusing. You could do build validate options result and build validate result in that scenario, but you still end up with a little bit of wonkiness either way.
Yeah, and if it's you're expecting it's unlikely, but it pops up, then build, because that's what shipped first, and then build validation result, and then people be like, yeah, it's a bit weird. It could have been named better, but that's better than one of them being a build and the other one being a 2. Because the problem is if you're looking at the docs for one of them, if you're looking at the shape of one of them, you don't have a gut instinct that there would be the other one. It can be solved in docs with a C also, but that's...
But look, the type is called validation option result builder. It's going to build validation option results.
Right, and then so that's the if in the future there's the same thing can also build, just looking at the types that are here, a validation result, then...
But then the type is misnamed. Won't that be confusing?
I don't know the order of these things. If you can get a validation result from a validate option result, then it's an accelerated path.
But the argument is that the names, if there's a name build and a name that's to something, that's confusing. But if the type is a validation option result builder and you can build other things with it, I'd argue that's also confusing. Then create a different builder that builds these other objects.
Yeah, but we have cases like immutable array builder, which have both to array and to immutable, because the to array is an accelerated path of...
Okay,
Right. Correct. So my point is, I think these discrepancies exist and are trivially resolved.
Sure.
Right?
No, it's a question of, do you expect short-term expansion? Like, do you see adding some other thing that this would build as an obvious addition in the same or the next version? And
so if we are thinking about to have like two validation results, this is very unlikely because validation results carry just one error. It's designed to carry just one error, not multiple errors. So you cannot have builder for it. So to answer your question is like, it's unlikely we will add something in the future to build something from it, other than validate option results.
fair enough. So, yeah, I think we have enough examples both ways that whatever name you guys want is fine. But you need to tell me so I can write it down.
I'm fine either way, but I mean like I got Eric Earhart point also about like ASP.NET, I mean hosting and this stuff using build all the time, so I will stick with build because this would be used in this context.
So Microsoft extensions star generally makes a builder with a thing called build. All right, so
Yes.
we'll call it build.
Yes.
Okay, did we get an answer on the question marks for add errors of enumerable?
No, I'm still looking. I can provide feedback later. I think calling the function there's no line number that add errors in the middle with that takes an enumerable. Yeah, calling that add validation results, and the one above as well would be a good change. I guess all the ones, yeah, add errors.
Okay, so add validation result and add validation results.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then would the bottom one be add validation options result?
Yeah.
So I wonder if that actually goes, again, hurts discoverability. These are all just adding more errors to the thing you're building. They're just being sourced from different places.
Well, the initial confusion raised was
It's
that it's null.
Yeah. Success. Yes. Add error success.
Well,
is there any
but
confusion if it's just
that's just because of the semantics of validation result. Yeah.
Is there any confusion if it's just called add?
I mean, technically, like, you're not a set, so add is expected to do something.
It is a builder though, and we use add on other builders.
But do we use add on other builders where the add doesn't do anything? I'm just like,
Yeah.
if it's
Well,
if it's
I
called
mean, if you add an empty string to a string builder, it doesn't do anything, right?
Nothing that you can observe.
Well, more appropriately, if you add null to a string builder, it's a no op, which is sort of the logical equivalent here, I guess.
Yeah. So the point of I think of this add error method is that you can call add error open paren and then call it under validation function, and you don't need to. If it's return success, it doesn't actually add the error.
Yeah, I think it's reasonable. This is called add result instead of add error or add something result, whatever we want to call it, and you just passing in the result of one of those validation methods and the types all line up, then it's perfectly reasonable. If null is defined to mean success, then it successfully adds success by doing nothing. I think that's totally reasonable.
Also, then calling everything just add would work.
Yeah, the reason I suggest maybe add, or I kind of like Steven's suggestion of add result, is just to avoid having both add validation result and add validation options result.
It's actually validate option results.
Okay, yeah, but avoid having the two different names that are functionally just overloads of each other, differing on type, which is a little bit different from add error, which is taking completely different sets of parameters that kind of operate differently.
Yeah,
but to me, this exactly matches the semantic reason why there's such a thing as overloads. They're all doing the same thing.
Well, but they're
just
not.
taking an input from different places.
There's no case where this one's gonna do nothing.
But that's just an attribute of the parameters it's taking. It's
like the overloading is generally for there are multiple ways of representing the input. This is an error. This is maybe an error. This is maybe an error. This is something else.
Yes, I'm not clear on that distinction. If I have an add method, one of which takes a string to represent an error, and one of which takes something else that might contain an error. It's just that in one case I know I have one, in another case I might have one, and it's still doing the same thing if both of them were an error.
Fair enough. I mean, like, I'm just saying where one can argue this isn't just overloading. It's they're slightly different. They have slightly different behaviors. If we want to say that add error of a validation result adds the error from the validation result, and if there is no error, there is no add. Like that's.
I mean, I'd be inclined
It's a
for them to
position.
all be add result, or add if that's appropriate, and the parameter name for the string or whatever is error. Like you're obviously adding an error.
Well, I guess I don't particularly have a strong opinion on it, but the reason why I wouldn't call the one that takes a string error just add is because it hurts potential future extensibility, and it makes the users have to read and understand the parameters. And we've frequently in the past had cases where we've changed the meaning of parameters or given the parameters a bad name and things like that. And so when you have something that's potentially ambiguous as to what it could be, like string, having how the string is interpreted in the name of the method makes it clear, which is a little bit different from validation result, where you can only interpret adding a validation result as kind of one way.
That's fair. I mean, if we want to have the ones that take validation result just be add, and the ones that take a guaranteed error be add error, and the one that is taking a validation result is logically doing a check and then, logically calling add error if there was one, that's also quite reasonable.
Yeah. But like I said, I don't have a strong preference. It's just it is just something that comes to my own mind when looking at the names of the APIs and figuring what they would do if not looking at things like parameter names and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think personally the add error, add result, and add results looks fine.
I'm fine with that.
Using the
That is
presumably the results ones, the IEnumerable one needs to be question mark, right?
we were still waiting on an answer of that, but it does seem the most sensible,
Yeah, I
and
think
is just that this is for each do that. So
we're also waiting on the constructor too, right? On line 25. If we needed
the constructor that takes the IEnumerable. Yeah. So I finally got my source base loaded. Let me see if I've got any uses.
Yeah, the constructor that it takes enumerable of string, I think it's matching the method that I pasted in the chat about inside validate option results. It has a method, it's called the fail, which is take IEnumerable of errors, which is
sure, but you could do the
Yeah.
for each yourself there. The question is this a common enough thing to do it? Because note, it does ignore the notion of tying any of these errors to any properties.
Well, and the thing that was pasted in chat looks to me like a factory method. You're basically saying, I've already gathered up all of my failures, produce a result from those. Whereas if you're creating a builder, you're trying to build something with multiple calls, or, one or more calls. And if you already know what the errors are, it's not clear to me why you would go through the builder. So the scenario for this would be you already have some errors and you want to potentially add more.
So there's the validate options result object exposes a failure messages a failures property that has an IEnumerable of strings. And when you're composing validation together, that's when these things kind of come together. So I've got these errors from different places, and they're being built into the final top level error.
So where does the property
call for
name go?
An add errors method that takes an IEnumerable of string? If you're going to potentially get these IEnumerables from multiple places, you would want to be able to add multiple enumerables.
Yeah, that would work as well.
I mean, otherwise you have this really weird inconsistency where you construct the builder with the errors from one of them, and then you for each the other ones to add the strings individually.
That's true.
Yeah. But if the options result has an error associated with a property, then what does that enumerable even do? Lose the data, or did it just turn that into a differently formatted string?
say that again. It's got two properties. It has a failure message, which is one string, and then failures, which is IEnumerable string.
Right, but we have this. It's shaped differently now, but we have this add error, an error associated with a property.
Yeah, this will be formatted into just one error and will be added to the builder.
So this, if you give a property name, it combines these two in a well-formed
Yes.
way and calls that error
Yes.
of the proposal as written here.
Mhm.
So this is just a format the string in a particular manner.
Exactly.
You're actually losing the data.
Yeah.
So I'm not seeing any uses in our code bases of the constructor that takes an IEnumerable of strings.
Yeah, and if it's so we could add this as add errors of IEnumerable string, or if the only place that people are expected to get this is off of one of these things dot failures, then we already have things that take one of these things.
Mhm.
So I think we could cut it until there's demonstrated need.
That's fine with me.
Okay, and to support pooling, do you want a reset method?
Or a clear method, I guess.
The name for pooling ends up being try reset, and it returns a boolean. Is the new what's been approved for that. But no, I guess I'll just change the generator to not allocate the object in the first place.
Yeah, that makes sense. So that basically means you're going to check the results for null before doing anything, right? You're going to, if result is not null, then lazy allocate the builder and add to it. Is that the plan?
Yeah. It's the code is much less nice to look at, but the generator doesn't care.
But does it hurt if we add the reset? I mean, even if you are not going to use it in R9.
I mean,
I'm seeing a big value for reset here.
Yeah, so the key is we added the iResettable interface, but it's added in the object pool package, which is built in the ASP.NET repo. So you couldn't have this type. I don't think could use that, right?
also presumably the ones you would care to pool here are the ones that don't have any errors associated with them, and the happy path. And at that point, we're talking about a really small object that's very fast to construct. Do these happen on paths that are so common that pooling them is actually beneficial?
It's mostly startup. There's a few places where this is used for processing incoming data, but it's mostly for options processing that we use that.
Yeah, I would
think, and the vast majority of use cases is through the code generator, and having the code generator check for null is easy. So I'm happy with the.
Yeah, I would stick with that. I think pooling for larger objects or for objects that are expensive to create is a win often, but for tiny objects, the cost of pooling can actually be worse than the savings. So I'd be inclined to not do anything here unless we actually found a real need and saw real benefits.
Although I don't know, adding a clear method would be fairly simple.
I have no problem with a clear method if we think that there's a use for it. I mean, we do that on lots of builders, right?
Yeah, so let's just add that, and then if you want to add that to a pool, then you just need to write a one-line wrapper that calls clear.
Do we need an indication of whether? I mean, you could just always call clear if you cared, but is there any kind of count or anything on here?
No,
Not
because you
very
got the whole shape on screen.
Yeah, you just call build, then clear, and then you're done. If you care.
And there's no
So
like diagnostic need for having a count, an error count or something like that. I don't care. I'm just double checking.
debugger display has one. So if that's the diagnostic that you care about, the debugger will track it.
Yeah.
Right. So for build, based on this, I believe you said that null represents the state where there's no errors. So should this build say that it's null returning, and if there are no errors, it returns null?
No, there's two. So there's two
there's different structs
results here. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
different-
validation result, the one above, comes from component annotations, and their null success, like there's a success field that's set to null, right? So null that means success. But validate options result, which is the thing that we're building, and then also the one that could take here, that one has a success which actually is an object. So this one I think shouldn't be nullable.
Right, because really it's just these two things seem to disagree on.
Right, and I'm saying we should use the bottom one, like validate option result should be non-nullable in both of them. Because if you build and you didn't add anything, that should return .success, which is an actual object. It's just the component model data annotation is one that does this funky thing with success being null. Is that making sense? There's two types here, and they both deal with success differently.
Yep.
Yeah, so build always return validate option result object.
Right. And the one that takes that add result that takes a validate option result should take a non-null object.
Okay. So does that look correct?
Yeah, looks good to me.
The IEnumerable of foreign object is lots of question marks, and the local object is no question marks.
Looks good.
And double checking, nothing new from chat. Alright, nothing new from chat. Sold. Add a type to represent IP networks based on the CIDR notation 799er46.
I can talk about this, also Martin. So Martin proposed this pretty common problem in my understanding on the R9 ask. And yeah, so my addition to his original proposal is basically making it span parsable, span formatable, and reviewing the naming, because originally it was proposed as with the name IP address range, and it's not really range A to B because it's defined by a mask. So I'm proposing this IP network name, which is also used by ASP.NET, and basically we agreed that if we introduce this type, then ASP.NET would obsolete their own type. So functional parts, really, this contains thing, which is about to decide whether an address is inside this network, and parsing equality, so pretty straightforward stuff. Yeah, also reviewed the naming based on recent types which were approved, so it looks like how we name things, these things, or variables. Wonder if there are any concerns.
I assume where this says it's equatable of IP subnet, that should now be IP network.
Okay. Yes.
Just making sure there wasn't another type we needed to be concerned with somewhere. So the only question I have is, why is mask length a byte? Because I don't think it's allowed to be the full range, at which point our convention says it should generally be an int.
Yeah, I just left it as Martin proposed. It can be an int, but I doubt it would be ever larger than 255. So probably it can save some space, at least if packing doesn't.
I mean, it can be stored as a byte. Just the public API. Like right now, IPv6 is only 128 bit length. So you should still already be throwing for anything over 128. That checks the same if it's byte or int.
Yeah, so if you think it's cleaner, then we can change it to int, yes.
So what's the benefit of an int?
Most people doing math in .NET have used int as the type that they're doing the math on, and if you make this take a byte, they have to write the hard cast.
Do math? Okay, I don't see anybody doing math on this value, but
so if you expect it to be a literal, then there's no reason to argue for one or the other. If you expect it to be a computed value, then int wins over byte. So what's the argument for byte, other than it's the smallest integral type that can contain all of your possible values? Because we don't use that in our API design. We use int unless there's a reason to use something smaller that's very strong.
When you pass something to the constructor, should we then throw if it's larger? Because then I guess the constructor argument should be also int. So this way...
Yeah, I was actually talking about the constructor argument, or constructor arg, which then spills over to the property. But
it should already have a length check anyway.
Right. Because I don't think there's any system where saying this is byte or this is byte is going to, save on a register allocation or make a shorter instruction set or shorter compiled instruction sequence. I think they're all just going to end up being the same I4. But that could be wrong. I guess byte will be a U4. But
well, but like you said, it could be still stored as a byte.
Right, because nothing in this says what the storage has to be.
Yeah.
This is just the public exposure of every time they call the mask length property, you can let it get extended into a signed int32.
Although realistically, it probably would still use the same amount of space from a rounding standpoint.
Yeah. It's going to be a
Make it an int.
32-bit value on 32-bit CPUs and a 64-bit value on 64-bit CPUs because there's nothing to pack with it. Assuming I understand how packing works.
How big is IP address? That
The reference
class.
type isn't.
that's a class. Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah. So then it makes no difference whether it's a byte, an int, or a long. It's all going to be the same.
Oh, it makes a difference between int and long on 32-bit.
Oh yeah. You still have people using that?
Yep.
Didn't we just add ARM32?
Okay. Anyway, then an int is fine.
I have a question regarding toString and try format. So how the format provider is used in toString with this case?
Not anyhow. This is basically just to implement the interfaces. So it's not
Because
gonna
you-
pass.
Yeah.
If it's to implement the interface and there's no reason to use format provider, should this then be explicitly implement the interface and expose a try format that drops the format provider parameter for the public surface area?
Yes.
What does the format string do? Or have we defined custom format strings for IP network, or is it passed down to something underneath?
No, not really. So I'm not aware of that.
So format is ignored as well?
Probably yes.
So the suggestion is to make both of these an explicit implementation and then add a parameterless toString and a try format that ends after char is written.
Well, there's already. toString is implied, right?
Yeah, it'd be overriding the object one.
Sure, but it's the only have the 0 argument toString and then on the
explicitly not.
Yeah, that seems reasonable.
You want the same thing for all the parse methods? All these providers are default to null, so you get the same effect by just not supplying them.
It's a question of when somebody looks at the type, right? They see IP network dot, let's go with try parse, and then they're like, oh, what provider could I pass? Plus, in fact, for try parse,
you can't.
You'd have to write the explicit null every time.
That's true.
So
Right, and
so saying these exist for the interface, but the public API doesn't talk about a format provider because you don't support formatting seems legit.
that also makes it simpler to argue for the quote-unquote break if we want to start supporting a format provider in the future, because then there's less users that will be implicitly impacted, since they couldn't have been calling this API without going through the generic route, in which case they don't know the type, or explicitly casting to the interface, which they have no real reason to do. So just less impacted users if we do want to support it in the future.
Oh, I see. And then we have so the parsing convenience methods will be the only ones that stay public. I guess we can get the simple parse as well.
I know in the discussions on here there was issues about IP address having a different kind of not implementing the interface. Is there a separate issue to track adding the interface support to IP address?
No, but we can add it.
I don't care. I don't need it. I'm just saying that if there was that work being done there, then you'd want the same kind of hiding the interface and exposing a simple
My concern was that we will never actually do it because it's not a priority. So
yeah.
Then we will end up with this asymmetric thing that IP network does implement those interfaces because we want this type to be modern and fancy, but IP address will not. And if we don't care, it will stay like this forever.
If it stays like this forever, it's because we don't care. So if we start caring, we fix it. I don't think that means we should remove them from here. I think it means if we're looking for consistency, we should add them there. And we should have a separate issue that proposes it, and if we care, we do it.
Sure, I'll file an issue then we'll see.
No, I think the main reason to have the interfaces is because it lets users write generic logging code more trivially.
Well, in particular,
the optimized thing.
The try format is nice, ISPAN formattable, because then in the logging path we don't need to instantiate strings. However, we don't tend to log IP addresses because it's customer sensitive data. So, like,
Alright, so the public formatting, I wrote the override string just so we can say that we talked about it.
Do we need the provider equals null default case in the very first explicit overload or explicit method? The first parse and also at the toString. The default null. If it's
I mean, if they're explicit, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
I mean, if it's being explicitly implemented, then that's slightly implied by.
But it's
not even
just
writing it
following the
down.
signature.
So
it's just following the signature of the
Yeah.
interface.
Oh, I see. Okay, I didn't know that.
yeah. All right. And then, yeah, I don't personally know if IP network is the best name, but I can't think of a better one. If it's used anywhere other than ASP.NET, so if it's used anywhere outside of .NET as the name of a thing, then that seems
From
great.
what I've seen, this is the most commonly used name in other ecosystems for similar types.
Fair enough.
I don't know if you have any suggestions.
No, I'm just the name IP network and saying that there's a type IP network. The thing that pops into my head first is that you're talking about something that's internet connected versus something that's air gapped versus something else. And
not super happy about that,
but I can't think of times when people would be like, "Oh, I have this type talking about my air gapped network." Like, well, how are you? You're either on it, in which case you're connected and that's all you care, or you're not, in which case you're not talking about it. So while it does not give an immediate what does it mean from the name, so that's my only concern with the name. Is my thought is air gapped versus internet connected is what this means, but if you then stopped and thought about it in code, it makes no sense. So.
There's IP subnet and IP address space are two other ones that seem reasonably descriptive.
We have a question from chat. How does this work with IPv6 addresses, which doesn't have masks but instead has prefix lengths?
Then we should probably rename the parameter to prefix length.
Would that be the
or just two lengths maybe? So.
I mean, the type is implemented for both already, right?
Yeah.
Is it not? Okay. I mean, prefix length works, I suppose.
unless is it the same semantic for CIDR? Because I think /32's the address is correct and not a range, right? Which means the mask is the prefix length. I'm just making sure that it's not for v4. It's how many bits are don't knows, and for v6 it's how many bits are do knows. As long as they have the same semantic, we can call it prefix length for both. Or mask length and just say IPv6 gets to use IPv4's terminology.
I can't like immediately answer this. Would need to think about it.
Otherwise, magic also works.
Yeah. So Wikipedia. I'm not going. Talks about host prefix bits, network prefix bits, and host identifier bits. It doesn't talk about a mask. Because in fact, that I think is from variable length subset masking. So the proposal talks about CIDR notation, but then the mask length is using conflating a previous specification. I think.
So what are you saying then?
It can be just length.
That calling it prefix length or prefix bits or prefix bit length or something. Like prefix seems to be the notation when given that we're talking about CIDR based on the subject of the issue.
Prefix length sounds good to me.
And then maybe this was asked, but there's no other APIs that will take this, produce it. It's just purely utilitarian.
As far as I know, no. So.
Yes, I mean, if you look in the Microsoft's various repos, you'll find dozens, if not hundreds, of versions of this type. So there's higher level utilities, even though if the framework itself isn't necessarily using it.
Yeah, I'm not pushing back. I'm just asking.
Okay. Well, okay. How about this? Are there any places in the API that should be using this type?
Yeah, I guess that's what I'm trying to ask.
So maybe there needs to be some new overloads added elsewhere that consume this.
I'm not aware of that.
Okay, so renamed mask length to prefix length, and are we happy with it at that stage?
One last question about this struct will contain only one IP address, right?
The base, yeah.
Yeah. So the method looks like some indication about like this contains multiple ones and you check one of them is exist or not from the name, I mean.
Which it does, right? Because basically you're saying it's a whole range of addresses, right? You're just saying that you have a base address plus the prefix length, right? So everything that is underneath it logically is contained inside of that IP network.
Okay, sounds good.
Right, so to take examples off of Wikipedia.
Wikipedia is not a source.
It is a source for examples.
Just ask ChatGPT.
That's a good question. Can you use that to quote in your work from now on? ChatGPT said this is true.
So.
Yeah, here you go.
Yeah. So you would say the network of this is your base address and how many semantic bits it has. Because this is in the non-semantic bits, it would say
Okay.
true.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah.
So is length always number of bits?
Yeah. So for v4 it'd be bounded by 32, and for v6 it'd be bounded by 128 if I can do 32 times 4 correctly. Yeah, I mean, contains feels, oh so slightly wrong, but I can't think of a better one. We could go covers address, but like contains is fine.
Encompasses.
Now we're getting even weirder.
I mean, I think contains is fine.
Seen other frameworks can even enumerate all the addresses. So if we follow that logic, contains makes sense.
Yeah, I don't want to know what enumerate means for IPv6.
It takes a while.
Well, but does it only enumerate things that aren't link local, or like IPv6 is weird? So yeah, I think contains is fine.
Ship it.
Sounds like it. And then I assume your or your format and your I think it's already correct on here. Your format and toString are based on the CIDR string syntax.
Yeah. Yes.
You keep bringing up CIDR. Like, what is it? Is it a code name for something?
CIDR.
CIDR.
Classless interdomain routing.
Ah.
CIDR.
Is it the spec for IP address syntax or something?
Or how you mask things.
Ah. The masking thingy, I see.
So it's the address /24 or /32 or whatever you want.
Ah, yeah, I remember this from like previous life.
Because in the early IPv4 world, we had class A, B, and C networks, and then those ended up being decided to be bad divisions. So yeah. All right, I should hit approved or something.
Wait. So before we do that, do we want to like obsolete the ASP.NET Core version? Sorry, if that's already been brought up.
Oh, there is one? I didn't know you had one.
Yeah, it's called the same thing. It came up in the comments. Sorry.
There is an issue about their obsolescence actually. So I thought it's planned to do it if we implement this type.
Where's the issue? Sorry.
I assume yours is not called system.net.ip network. But
It's
No,
not the
it's-
same namespace. No.
It's Microsoft
It's-
ASP.NET Core HTTP overrides.
Yeah,
Okay.
if you scroll down, you should be able to find the ASP.NET issue.
Got it. You've already talked to Chris about it. We're good.
Yeah.
All right. That is all.
okay.
See, if we had namespace forwarding, we could actually make it compatible.
Yeah,
probably
but
not
it's a
called
class.
prefix
This one is a
length.
struct.
Yeah, get David and Jared in a room and
Oh, you made it as class? You monsters. Yeah, okay, then.
all right. Developers can safely trim apps which need configuration binder 444903. Mr. Earhart.
Cool. I'll take this one. So the goal of this issue of this work is to add a new source generator for something called configuration binding, which is used by ASP.NET Core customers. So the binding is done using one or more configuration providers, and these providers read data as key value pairs using a variety of sources, including like settings files, like app settings or JSON environment variables, and the command line arguments, which my example we use here, and a few other sources. At the core of the mechanism is configuration binder and extension class in our platform extensions. That's just the Microsoft extensions or star packages. And apologies for everybody who's very familiar here. I'll just like read it like anyway. So configuration binder provides these bind and get methods that does this binding / mapping. So the input to the operation is a configuration instance, and yeah, so we're binding them to strongly type objects, and this is for convenience and to provide like options to their apps. So the current approach uses reflection, which is bad for trimming and like our current native AOT efforts. So I'm providing an example here of code that will invoke the binder. This is really just code that is just specifying some options to an application, but ultimately it funnels down to the binder. So we'll have a web application builder, which contains a host, which is responsible for app startup and lifetime management, and also contains the default configuration for the app, which is specified through one of those providers we saw above. So in this case, this is specified from command line. So that's the first line there. Then iConfiguration section, which implements iConfiguration that I mentioned earlier, allows you to get a section of the configuration object. So, you know, like so this is expected to map the shape of the like the target config type. So and if configuration instances contain like a key value pair, just similar to JSON, where you have key and okay, I've said that a few times. So the next line here, configure. So you have the builder.services. We initialize the builder, and so these services are just like, I mean, that's the notion of ASP.NET services that allow various operations on your application. So we want to give these services like options to use configuration values like for whatever your application needs. So you're configuring you're specifying the type of this configuration target type, and also like a section of configuration input values that is supposed to bind to these options at runtime. So underneath, like this configure method would eventually call the binder to say binder.bind. I mean, passing it like the configuration instance and the target type. So that's, and this configure call. So the way the source generator will work, and I'll talk about that more, will be to like find this configure method, and and the ones. So there are a few. So we're looking at the ones where we can determine statically like the configuration type. So there are a few other overloads, but starting with we're just looking for the ones where we can find the type. Anyway, so we're going to generate a replacement for this call, and the way that this call will be, like the generated code will be used, is the compiler like preference characteristic, where if you generate to, in this case, we're generating to a global namespace, like another extension class that contains like an like a replacement for this method. So the compiler picks that one instead of the ones that we ship in the framework. This is not where we want to land ultimately, but I'll just go on for now. So yeah, to get a section of your options, you call section.get. Get is another like method that we want to like keep track of. And so the get method here will initialize an instance of your target type, and then bind the configuration values to that instance. And the next call here is the section.bind, which takes an instance, an already initialized instance. We'll do a null check, and binds values to that instance, potentially overwriting like what was there before. Then the rest of it is just the example is just running the application, specifying a HTTP GET operation, like request and response. and then showing the shape of like the configuration, like options class, you know, and the input config values are supposed to like map to this, and then we'll do like validation of the shape and stuff like that.
So the code the user writes doesn't change, right? So it's the same code you would write today with where everything is reflection based, right?
Yes, and that is the like sort of the user experience that we want to have for this feature, as opposed to something like JSON where they have to change their code. So we're trying to go for a more implicit model. So ultimately, like we're doing the compiler preference, but we're relying on that now. But you know, I mean, I think perception is that that is not like a very reliable or sort of mechanism. So ultimately, we want to utilize the call site replacement feature that the Rosen team is currently designing, I believe. So for so the MVP of this will just perform like this, and then as that feature becomes available, we'll still be generating the same code functionally, but the way we hook it to the user application will change as far as our implementation of the end-to-end. But the user experience, the target user experience is so that like they do not change much of their code. So we still need a gesture for the source generator, which I'll show, so that users that don't want to use it, or cases, especially as we implement, like we're going to implement this incrementally, where like we have some functionality that works from the start, and then we will go on and keep. I can give some examples as we go along of things. Anyway, does that answer your question?
Sort of. So you're saying there is a gesture for it to be kicked off, and presumably you imagine that to not be the C# code, but somewhere in the project file then?
Yes, there's a compiler visible property that we're going to probe for. So that is like a first approach that we'll do for like early previews. I show that like if you scroll down, show what that would look like in the user's project. Yeah. I guess ultimately we would want to add this directly to the SDK, something that the SDK, but we don't need to do that now. I mean, that is a bit more involved, so I'm sort of teasing that off for now.
I mean, assuming there are no takebacks, then ideally this would be on as soon as somebody enables trimming, right?
Yes, like the bootstrapping that we would want to do will make the generator available, but it still wouldn't run unless it saw like some explicit gesture, which would either be like in this case, if we don't take it back, like would be this, or it would be the user still specifying like a property, MS build property in their project. Because we want to always have a way to like for users to not use the source generator, at least for this generator. And I think from discussions with the other source generators in flight for .NET 8, that this seems to be like the common sort of like approach for
I think Emma's question is about like, is this property would be on by default while you?
No, I mean that was the first thing I said.
Right.
If you set native AOT or publish trimmed, we would turn this property on by default. Yes, I think that's the right behavior.
Yeah.
Okay.
You could turn it off. You could be published trimmed and then turn this property off, and then you would not be using the source generator, and you'd get warnings that said, "Hey, you're using the reflection path and it's unsafe."
Right. I mean, that's why I said, like, assuming there are no takebacks, right? If it's just, it does more work than necessary when you're going purely reflection, it makes sense that for that scenario, it's opt-in. But if it's really about making trimming safer, then it seems you want to turn it on by default when trimming is enabled, and then, stuff just happens to work better, right?
But you're talking about it as being on and off. Does it not, like, almost every other generator I can think of, we apply to a method or a type,
right?
And this seems to be to a compilation.
I mean, I think this is kind of the root question, right? So like, I think for the other generators, the problem is it is not an equivalent experience, right? Like there is some nuance to it that you can't hide, right? So that the user has to be aware, and then things work differently. You have to call different APIs, right? And as soon as that's the case, I think it makes sense to say the opt-in is changes to your source code, right? If it's the source code works the same as before, you don't have to change anything you're doing in your source code, and that's by design, then it would seem very weird if you now have to artificially modify your source code to get the analyzer, right? Or to get the generator behavior,
I see.
right?
Right. All our existing existing source generators did have new API, like you had to attribute this partial method or attribute this partial class, right?
Right.
Here, there's already this API that exists today that works away, and what we're wanting to do is intercept calls to that API.
I think
So
this is
in
in the
.NET
spirit
8
of. So I was just gonna say this is the spirit of like the effort for like minimal APIs where like users don't have to add a lot of code. No, that's my understanding.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
That's exactly
go ahead,
right.
Steven. Okay.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Yeah, is that's the plan for the minimal API route handlers as of right now.
But you said something about, doing things incrementally. So possibly that means there are things that the reflection model can do that your generator can't do, and then does somebody have to say it's off for their entire project, even if they may have 30 or 40 of these types that are impacted?
That is the current behavior. So I mean, you could turn it on. Like we look at the generated code in a little bit. We only how that will manifest like not supported cases would be we throw not supported exceptions for like for instance types with parameterized constructors are not supported yet. So if you have like that in your graph and you happen to hit that runtime, then like that's the mode of failure. But to answer your question, yes, it's you might be in an unfortunate case where like we don't cover your scenario, you don't get it at all. But hopefully you will like log an issue, and then we can like prioritize the implementation based on.
I mean, that
On,
delays you by a year. So
I
But
mean,
I think that's
by
I think we need to differentiate the what we're talking about here, right? So like I think when I say on by default when you're trimming, right? So like trimming is already an opt-in thing, right?
Sure.
And we know when you turn on trimming, stuff may not work, right? And so by saying, okay, this is on as soon as you enable trimming, well, chances are we just make trimming now work, right? Before it wouldn't have worked. Now it's possible that your code still doesn't work because, well, the source generator can't handle all the crazy options you have, and at which point you would have to modify your source code, right? But I think it's fine to say, okay, there's no explicit gesture in source code for this particular generator because the gesture is you enable trimming.
that's fair. I mean, so I'm just pointing out a slight difference of because you used a feature in your type that the generator can't handle, it means that you've now excluded the possibility of identifying that the generator generated non-equivalent code in some scenario. Because you had to, if you have 30 different types that it's going to do generation for, one of them it can't handle, so you have to now turn it off. You can't learn about patterns that you had in the other types that would have produced bugs. So now you're delayed by another preview or another year, depending on if it's an RTM gap or a preview gap. So I'm just suggesting that you might want type level opt-in or out, but maybe I'm wrong.
Well, I mean, I think the question is this not the same problem, right? So if the problem is we can't see certain things statically, then it sounds to me if you're enabling application level trimming and you turn this feature off, then it's not that it suddenly works, right? It's just, well, it didn't work because we couldn't know what you were doing. And, when we do trimming at the app level, we kind of rely on the fact that we know what you're doing statically, and now you have different kinds of bugs, right?
I guess, yeah,
So it seems like a conceptual problem of the particular
if the
static
trimmed
analysis
isn't doing reflection fallback and just making your app less trimmed because you left on the reflection mode, then I guess you took not working into working. But I don't know. I mean, if the idea is that it's producing 100% equivalent code, just moving the reflection logic into generation, then it should be fine. I just,
ultimately,
as a person who distrusts when computers do things, the notion of I wrote some code and the generator is now doing something for me that I can't see or turn off is
that's fair.
Weird.
So if there's like a type that the generator didn't catch, will that will you like look through all the call sites and emit a warning and basically say like, here's a call site where like we can't, I mean, so presumably there's the overloads that don't work, right, that are non-generic, and those will still warn with the trimmer warnings.
Yes, we can rely on the trimmer warnings for that rather than like emit our own diagnostic. But we could go either way if we want to have like diagnostics issued by this generator saying like I saw you try to, yeah, exactly what you're saying, but the trimmer warnings you covered that already. And then
So I
if
guess
we
my
get like a, okay, go ahead.
Sorry, I guess my question is that not supported exception we're looking at right now. Like,
Yeah.
is that going to be there, or is it going to try to fall back to reflection? And if so, could that really be hit in practice?
I think we should stick to the not supported. You get the exception at runtime, and not use reflection, which would be like against like all the like the goals of not using reflection and
Right.
AOT friendly.
And no fallback.
But if
No fallback.
no fallback. Essentially, like Jason, we could design API to like, conditionally include a fallback, but why? I think the goal would be to, yeah. I mean, in the spirit of like the JSON generator and other generators, not to have a fallback, but if we find that we need to do it, we could always do that.
No, you're right. I was trying to like respond to Jeremy's commentary about like, are people going to be able to turn this on, or is everyone going to like, because it doesn't support one of their 20 call sites, just going to have to like use reflection, perhaps. And is there a way to like partially test it? But that is difficult.
Yeah, if the reflection isn't going to be turned on, like that there is no notion of doing a fallback, then the warning of like, by the way, if you hit this line of code, things are going to go poorly for you. I hope it's not actually reachable in your trimmed app. Would be, I mean, that seems fine. And then presumably if you turn off the generator and you're in a trimmed app, then all of this is failing. And so
I have a question. Like, so how does this general interception work? Doesn't the user get a warning now that the configure of T method now has basically comes from the framework and there is user code for it?
Not from like my latest testing.
I think that this is hitting the resolution order of extension methods that presumably inside the assembly wins over outside the assembly.
I did notice that and it was a question I had for some person, say Roslington, if the calling code is like in the namespace of the configuration binder, we like it will pick the one we ship in the framework. Mm-hmm. So I think that's just like I don't know if that's like common knowledge, but that surprised me.
The Roslyn feature will solve this. The Roslyn feature
we will not even have this problem.
This source generated code intercepts or replaces this method in the framework.
Oh, there's a first class feature for that in the Roslyn source generators that allows you to do that?
There will be. Language feature like proposal.
Okay.
But how is it working today? Because right now, like the get extension method and stuff is in a different assembly, right? Like the generic get on configuration.
Wait, which one are you talking about?
Because it's IC. Yeah, all right.
Yes, this is generated users or something.
Right. So
because it's a global namespace.
Yeah,
you basically just hijack name lookup, right? You just rely on the fact that the compiler prefers this one because it's local. I just remember vaguely there were cases where you get warnings, but I think maybe the warnings are when the type has the same namespace and name, at which point the compiler says, hey, the type exists in two places. I prefer the one from your assembly, but that's only for type names maybe.
I found that to be the case, like if I was to generate a get method for each specific type rather than like this generic one, then I get like some warning. I forget the exact characteristics, but there are cases where, like I know what you're talking about. I ran into it like in some.
Well, that's another thing. You can't overload on constraints in C#, on generic constraints. So if you try different methods for each generic type, it doesn't work like it would maybe for C++
but that's not
or something.
But that's not a constraint. That's just OLED resolution, right? So that was my other question. Like, why do we need the generic one? Why can't we just have a configure non-generic that takes a, whatever the, my options, right? Directly as an argument, because that would also be preferred over the generic one, right? I mean, who's calling them generically? Probably
Everyone.
Yes. And
What do you
also
mean?
like size,
I mean,
I think.
Are
This
you
is
saying that?
intercepting existing calls. People call like get and configure with the generic argument like all the time.
Is it frequent for the generic argument to be a struct, or is it mostly going to be a class?
It's structs are not supported. Is
But value types.
my understanding.
Nice.
So should T be constrained to be class then?
Well, I mean, that
Structs are
would make sense.
supported. You
Are
can
you
have a
sure?
property
They're definitely
of a complex struct. You can have a property of a complex struct, like we do with JSON writer options.
properties can
Okay.
definitely be value types, but yeah.
Right, but not just
yeah.
simple value types like
Yeah.
other structs with like 6 properties inside of it.
For sure. And like, are you 100% positive you can't do like top level structs as things?
Sorry. Eric Erhard, what was that? So you said like we can have a property of a complex struct, and that should work.
It works today, yes.
It works today. Okay, but not top level struct. Like
I don't see why they would. I don't see why they.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah. I just wasn't sure what you were saying. Okay, but that makes sense.
Right.
And
I mean,
if
I
you're gonna keep
assume
listening, so-
when the rewrite the call support for generators is added, this could, instead of calling generic dispatching configure, it could call dedicated configures if that works out to be better. I mean, like, so one thing I see is you say that you're generating something that is public.
internal. Sorry.
Okay. That was because we should not be adding public types to an assembly if it just as a function of whether or not it was compiled with trimming enabled, or that someone went out of their way to turn on the generator. Because presumably the generated version of this is going to be more performant because reflection's always slow. So I could see libraries wanting to turn on a generator version of things, but then presumably that's going to be more like JSON, where you do need to expose public API, which means you kind of need to opt into it.
Why wouldn't you just set the MS build property?
Well, if it's public and it needs to support cascaded calls, if it needs to support cascaded calls, which is what the JSON one does, then somewhere you need control over what's the namespace and such, and they need to not all just be in the global namespace, because great, I have 7 libraries that I called that use generated configuration types, and now I need to use assembly qualified labels, and that's a pain in the butt to get your calls dispatched right.
I mean, that's my general, I think, problem with source generators. It's kind of like they don't compose well across library boundaries, right? Because you either have this JSON model where you manually have to stitch stuff together, or you basically say, screw this, every consumer basically generates their own version of that method, right? And that's basically, I think, the model that is here, right? So
Right.
basically it just means that the application ultimately has a bind method per type that it happens to use, right? And then you don't get to use the library provided one.
This won't need cascaded calls though, unless I'm missing something. Like if I have like I do have a library that needs this, right? We have console logging, use the reflection one. I just changed it to manually do what the source generator is going to do, because of the same reasons why we're building the source generator. It can use its source generated version by itself internally. Nobody needs to ever need that code. Then the app, another library could do the exact same thing, have its own set of this code, and then the app has whichever ones that it needs. Like they're all self-contained, if that makes sense. They're only contained in the library that needs them.
Okay, so nobody in the calling application would need to call the configure for a type that was in the library. It handled it somewhere else on its own.
I mean, if it needed it, this would just regen it in the application itself.
That's what I'm saying. So like, I don't know how the application could ever discover the library provided generator.
It doesn't need
It
to.
would regenerate it based on the public shape.
Right. The only way it would need to is if it was binding some other section of the configuration to a type that was shipped in a different library.
Maybe I'm missing something, but isn't the idea in general with this whole app host builder thingy that ultimately the app is the only party that basically composes stuff? I mean, the library would provide the my options type, right? But the library would never call into app host builder configure services, right? Why am I missing something?
That's like, I think you're thinking about dependency injection in general. This is just saying, like, this is saying I have some sort of DI service, right, that needs to read its configuration from an iConfiguration, and I have a strongly typed my options class, and I want to pull all the configuration data into my options class so that way I can programmatically code against it. So if I have a library like console logging that has configuration stuff that comes from a configuration, I have some options classes like what colors you want to use or what log level you want to use. The configuration binds to those, and then I use them in my library.
I see. It's what you're saying is basically in the console example, the console options are an internal type for that library. And the public API of this console thingy gets an iConfiguration, and then internally it just happens to call the bind method to get something strongly typed back, but the application doesn't have to know that, right? Because
right, more or less. The options are actually public, but yeah, the fact that we're using the bind method to get the configuration to feed into the options is all internal. Nobody needs to know about it.
I see. So that means the generator thing, right now it's public, but it could be completely internal, right?
Well, I questioned public and Laomi said internal. So if this is
It's
just
internal.
Okay. I see. Okay.
as long as it's actually internal,
Type of-
then
It won't need to chain. Your application should never need to call into some library's generated configuration stuff.
Okay. That makes sense. I think now I'm on the same page as the rest of you.
I'm probably half a page behind, but willing to believe that I can eventually get there.
Honestly,
Oh, sorry.
I was
Go
gonna
ahead.
say, honestly, I think we've discussed like all of the document here, so I think the rest is questions and discussion. Then at the end, I can talk about next steps if they haven't come around. So, go ahead, Tana.
I just had a question on for the first two things that are being listed as source generated, so configure and get. What's preventing those from? Why do these have to be generated extension methods? It looks like based on the APIs that they're being called into, and the shape of the API in general, like a get could just be where t is class comma new, and configure looks like it doesn't actually need anything other than just services configure my options. I'm not understanding why there needs to be a generated extension method for it. It looks like the existing generic APIs plus a general generic helper method with a slightly different constraint would satisfy both of them.
Speaking about common new, like it's not just objects with parameterized constructors that we want to support. I mean, with the parameterized constructors. So that generic constraints won't help us in like the general case. But and other part of the, I mean, this generated shape is supposed to exactly mimic the existing implementation so that we can pick it.
right. And this is, but this is a point in time detail, right? It's because
Yeah, exactly.
the generators feature doesn't allow you to rewrite existing code. All you can do is throw an extension method in with higher binding to beat the extension method it's currently calling.
Correct.
For the other constructors, was there any consideration on using static abstracts and interfaces to achieve the same thing? Because you could just expose an I options of like T1, T2, and then have that expose a static T options create that takes the T1, T2 parameters. and then you can do all of that without a source generator instead, and through well-defined contracts.
Sorry, I had to drop, and like I was getting on a call, so I was on hold for a second.
Okay. So I was just asking, like, what was there any consideration on doing this rather than through a source generator, through something like static abstracts and interfaces, which allow you to strongly model the contract of effectively constructors with parameters without having to generate sources for everything. I'm not saying that it's necessarily better or anything, just wondering if that was considered at all.
I didn't consider that, but something I could consider like moving forward. Ultimately, like we want the generated code, regardless of what it looks like, to be called over like the existing calls. So as we like look at the call side replacement feature, then that will enable us to like call code that takes on any shape.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, but thanks for the shout. I will look into that.
So Tanner, do you have preference here? I mean, like this method or your method?
No, it was so it sounds like this example just wasn't showing the full set of cases that the generator is going to support. It's showing a simple case that could be done a different way, but the different way is not going to work for everything without also looking at things like other interfaces or functionality to make it possible.
Tanner, was your proposal about having the type itself opt into a factory method?
Yeah, basically.
I see.
Like if the purpose of get is to basically create the T, bind it, and then return the T, the alternative instead of a source generator would be have the types opt into it via like creatable T self.
I can create myself.
It's and then you can have reflection and source generator free binding.
Someone still has to author the bind calls to manually unpack the E from the actual config into the object itself. Like if you scroll down some more, there's like a call to bind core or something that actually does this part of it. That's the source gen part. That's like
actually, I remember.
So it would save on the first two, but not the actual bind ones. Okay.
Right. Yeah, the method overload thing is, no one says hacky. It's amazing. When we get the feature where Rosin can replace the call size, we could probably use that as well. But I don't know if it would make it. It'd make it a bit cleaner because you wouldn't need to branch here, I guess. But it depends on how the feature turns out. So
yeah.
I wouldn't be shocked if it's not supported because it's a generic.
Generics, yeah, I was gonna say generics are a little bit trickier.
So once this word changes from public to internal, then what's the question for API review?
I mean, so what's interesting with this particular API is basically we generate code that the user will never directly call, right? There's no expectation that the user actually uses those APIs, right? So I'm almost thinking maybe we should actually apply editor browsable so that the user's API notion is basically the framework API rather than the source generated hijacked version of that API, because I think that might make more sense.
So the core of your statement is to add editor browser never, so that
because I mean the other question I have is like what happens with the editor experience. So one concern that I have is when they edit their program file, right, program.cs for the minimum APIs, and they start calling configure, can they get into cases where Roslyn tries to be smart and says, oh, there's now two configures, there's the framework one and there's yours, let me be helpful and add a fully qualified namespace name in front of that or something like that, right? So that might actually undermine the entire user experience here.
Yeah, one question, because you're hijacking a call shape and throwing something in the global namespace, is whether it be the the Roslyn feature or the resharper feature or something end up seeing the after pass 2, and it's like, oh, you can drop this redundant using statement. Nothing ever depended on it anymore. If you're already going to have enough cases that it should have been relevant, then that's probably won't come up. But it's just one of those, like, are we going to convince tools that you should now change a line of your code and now your code breaks and the tool doesn't understand why?
Yeah, that's another interesting point. I think that these are the kind of places we should actually validate as part of the developer experience, and that should also provide feedback for whatever the Roslyn feature ends up being.
Yeah, and presumably in your generator, if someone actually calls the extension method using static invocation syntax, presumably your generator needs to just yell at them now because you can't intercept that without the rewrite.
Yeah.
Do you want to yell though?
You mean you're going to tell them you're linking this call to configure is going to fail because we've turned off all the reflection stuff. I wasn't allowed to rewrite this because you wrote it using static syntax instead of extension syntax.
What ends up happening today is you would end up getting a warning because if you were trying to be linker friendly or friendly for those scenarios, those methods are marked as unsafe for linking. So if we don't hijack your call site, you get a warning anyway at build time. And you can choose to ignore it, but it will still warn you.
Right, but presumably the generator should, if it hits the case that you wrote it using static invocation syntax.
It can, yeah.
Then the generator pointing out, I wasn't allowed to rewrite this line, you need to rewrite it for me. Until you get the Roslyn feature of rewriting code.
That could be a code fix too. I mean, like, you could imagine when you change to this mode in AOT, we could detect the static call and then give you a control dot to, like, it's kind of weird, but
right.
It's a way of, like, helping you.
Just saying, if you get the warning
our expectation is that the new Roslyn feature and this source generator ship at the same time. So, like,
fair enough.
If that plan changes, we've got a bunch of things we need to revisit bigger than this.
Yeah.
Fair
everything
enough.
else.
Okay. But yeah. So, to me, as long as the class is generated internal, I mean, internal still means it's visible and people can write direct calls into it. So, don't go too crazy. But the shape here seems like it's using all the verbs from the existing thing, just redirecting them inwards. So.
I think my last question is, like, in terms of how the analyzer, how the generator is being kicked off, make sure you're not running yourself into a loop where you're looking for the framework use, then you emit the file. Now the framework API is no longer used. You stop emitting this file, and now you're stuck with something that doesn't actually work, depending on how often your analyzer or generator is being emitted, right?
Yes, detect if you're calling the framework one or yourself.
Right. Well.
Every other compile fails.
Yeah, basically, that's what I'm trying to avoid.
Just keep track somehow.
That works fine because the extension method, I believe we look for the one in the framework specifically, so it won't bind to this one on the second pass.
Right, but then you might stop emitting the file, right? So that's why I'm saying because you no longer find the use for the type, right?
Would that happen?
Alternatively, if someone took this generated file and checked it in, I guess if they checked it into their project, you actually don't want the generator to run.
Would
yeah,
the
exactly.
source change?
No, because they'd be doing a call to the non-generated their version of configure, which they wrote as an extension intercept. So.
Oh, okay, their case.
Yeah. Anyway, I think Emo's point is
API review is like, yeah, I think my API review concern is mostly about the way this generator is being hooked up and making sure that it doesn't break the UX, right? So that's what I'm saying. I think we should think of IntelliSense. We should think about, the Jeremy's concern about unnecessary usings being removed. And I think we should make sure that all of that works the way we want.
Thanks. I'm writing a list of these things here. If it can be included in the notes here, that would be cool.
Yeah, to answer Eric's question, I think we can. I think what would be helpful is if somebody can do the homework and make sure that the UX is actually sound.
And what's the experience in this world if somebody is using these with VB or COBOL.net or whatever? You don't get to trim?
I think
I guess trimming,
right.
or yeah, I don't know if
I think
trimming
source
even
generators are
supports these
only
things.
for C#.
Yeah.
Okay.
They may also
yeah,
be for
no.
F#, but the question is what's the scenario for config binder if someone wants to write their app in COBOL.net and trim? Because trimming sounds language independent. Is there the scenario is sorry it doesn't work? You have to go
I would
figure out
say
this generated code and write it yourself?
I think isn't that generally
I
the
think that's
problem
what
of
we are.
everything we have? I mean, this is not new. I think the generators we only support for C#, and we can only support them for C# and VB. And I think even there we mostly do C#. I'm not even sure we do VB for most of them.
Okay, so C# and VB are what work, not C# and F#. Okay.
Yeah, well, because it's a Roslyn feature, right? F# is not based on Roslyn, right? So they don't have
Fair
a
enough.
generator concept. And so that's the general problem with all of them. And so, yeah, you're basically stuck with two languages by using those features. I think that's a general problem in the .NET ecosystem, but I would think that if we cared enough, eventually there might be a solution to that problem. Like a generator that can emit IL. I don't know.
Yes, but then we need the feature that lets you combine, well, basically combine languages in one project without using a subsequent merger.
Yeah, which is the hard part.
Yep.
Well, generator is supported for VB. I just not sure that we actually write the code that emits VB. That might be on our end, because that's a per generator thing, right? I think for code fixers, I think we said we want to support both. I'm not sure we have the same bar for generators today. Alrighty, so then I think we're off until Thursday, right? Is that where we are? And then we bring this thing back on Thursday, first thing, and then do the other
Wait.
things we didn't get
I mean,
to today.
what's left
Is
from
there
this?
anything blocking? Yeah, I know we need to come back like for some other cases in the future, but is there anything blocking from like opening a PR and like implementing this?
Exactly. I'm unclear
It
as
doesn't
to
seem to me.
what
yeah.
we're even talking about in this meeting. I mean,
I
it's
mean,
generating
I
a type,
think
and
the
once we say it's
guidance I was
internal,
told
it's
was that we should
it's gone.
come to API review for such generators. I think like the opt-in or versus opt-out is API. So I think that there's a general question of like when should such generators come to API review? Like I think they should be reviewed on some level.
Right, but in this case, everything you're generating, I guess I don't know like about the thing here that's marked internal, but if presumably all of these things are using the signatures of existing types and you're just masking them, which means there's nothing for us to really talk about. If you're introducing a new, like if you're making something callable that used to not be callable, you're introducing something a user can interact with, and then we would care. Like this was public, I cared, so it shouldn't be.
I think I'll keep that in mind like moving forward. I just thought the assumption was that we should bring all of them to API review.
Indeed, I'm just
Well, public internal isn't the thing, right? If it's inside the same project, but the major thing is that it's matching the shape of right. Because like if we added new internal API, but it's in your project, like you would care.
Yes.
Right.
Once it's generated, internal is, but this definitely shouldn't be public because now you've changed the visible state of an assembly based on whether or not somebody turned on the generator. It's for this one. It feels like the answer is once this is internal, these are matching existing signatures. Then we go great. As long as you don't change those rules, then you're good to go.
I mean, in a sense, like what we're reviewing here is the developer experience of using the configuration APIs, right?
Sure.
In the context of a source generator, right? The fact that it doesn't
that's fair.
produce net new APIs, that's part of the experience.
Yeah. So, but my question, you say it needs to come back as the first thing on Thursday. I don't I don't know
So,
what we didn't talk about.
I don't think so.
So the reason I'm asking is because Eric was asking this in chat, so I kind of assume that he wants to talk more about it.
Okay.
But I feel like basically just the questions we all asked, right? Somebody needs to do that homework, and it doesn't have to be by Thursday, by the way. Like, I mean, it's just that the next meeting happens to be Thursday. If you say Tuesday or Thursday next week, that's also fine.
I'm
I
just
know
Before we
that-
review it, we should have answers to that.
I'm just asking, are we not giving it needs work or approved at this point?
I would give it needs work, just from a point of view that we want to make sure that the UX works the way we want, and if it doesn't, then maybe we have to tweak the way we emit this code, right?
The needs work seems to be hinging on the Roslyn compiler feature ultimately. I don't think that.
I think
and
that's-
I'll also like watch out for like the stuff we talked about, like where like make sure that we're not like detecting the same call twice and stuff like that. But it
Right.
seems peripheral to like the core like mechanism of how we want to implement it at this point.
Yeah,
Like
I think
my
that's
thinking is get it out in early preview. Watch out for the feedback, and then come back based on changes that we need to make. But I mean, I would definitely bring it back to say, okay, Roslyn isn't adding new, like isn't doing this feature, then we need to like come back again. But I think like given like the possibilities that we have today, it seems like this is where we're at, like a reasonable starting point, I would say.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would probably mark it needs work just so we have it tracking somewhere, and then we can, I'm fine with shipping something in preview that is needs work. Other people may have a different opinion on this, but I think the question is, the open-ended questions are basically, okay, if there was a feature, we should probably be using it here and not do our crazy thing here. If there wasn't feature doesn't work for us, we should probably work with them and make sure that we understand what the, we know why it doesn't work and how we want to work it around. And then I think then the other question is just the general user experience of, IntelliSense, unused usings, Roslyn trying to be helpful by inserting them, right? All of that stuff.
Yeah. I just appreciate if like the notes can just include that needs work isn't blocking like us from merging a PR explicitly, just for like
I think that's fair. I think
the optics, yeah.
I'm also fine with approving it and then just file tracking items for the remaining work. That's also fine. I mean,
Yeah,
whatever.
I do have a tracking issue for that. I'll get at the bottom of the description here.
I mean, you have one for the Roslyn feature, right? But I think there's the other questions of the general UX, right?
Yeah. The issue I'm talking about, tracking issue, includes like all the follow-up work, including like waiting for Roslyn, like any like issues we foresee, like you mentioned. So I will include those into that tracking issue.
I will keep this issue need works till we finish the whole work for the generator. I mean, including Roslyn stuff and everything. I'm not sure.
I'll say keep it
like,
open.
this doesn't stop you from checking stuff for preview builds and this stuff.
I mean, that's what we have said. I think the question is like, how does Stephen feel about this? And I mean, in the past, I've always been, contentious. So I don't have strong preferences. Like either way works for me.
Yeah,
I'm also fine with approving it.
Yeah, if we don't approve, like just a statement saying like that isn't blocking like the margin of an implementation. But so I don't care that way as long as I'm able to like merge the implementation for now.
Good enough.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you. Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone.
Alrighty. See ya.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. I think we actually got through more than I expected to. And explicit sorry to Kevin for missing a question you asked about IP network, but we'll let that come up in a future proposal to extend the IP network type when it has a strong scenario. And yeah, I think everything else got addressed not necessarily explicitly, but through the discussion. And yeah, but either it was laggy or I did a bad job of monitoring. So sorry. And with that, we are well over time, and we'll see everyone on Thursday at our same .NET time on our same .NET channel. Until whoever owns that phrase gets mad at me. Ciao.